Fat of the Land, Wilhelmir Stephenson. Chapter 1, Preliminaries and Speculation. Disclaimer. There's quite a bit of evolution talk. I'm not a big fan of the theory of evolution. It's nonsense. I hope if you disagree with me, you won't turn this video off, because, I mean, this guy agrees with you. Very briefly, the first cell could not have happened by accident because a cell is too complex. It requires DNA, which is basically computer code. You can't have an author without, or you can't have a book without an author. A cell is a machine. It's a mechanism, has parts, needs fuel. You can't have a machine without an engineer or several engineers, as the case may be. So, even though I disagree with many points made in this book, in that respect specifically, the rest of it is so valuable and fascinating, it's worth ignoring. Okay, I'll try not to make too much commentary, but maybe you'll see my commentary if you're watching the video, not just listening. Maybe you'll even hear it in my voice, but you'll definitely see some facial expression commentary. All right. Without further ado, preliminaries and speculation. See, he admitted speculation. All right. The saying that a man is what he eats derives an expanded significance from the theory that development from apehood to humanity was caused by a change in diet. The school of scientists which believes that food made men of apes pictures a remote age when the climate of the old world was so rainy that forests were spread over most or all the tropic and subtropic lands of Europe, Asia, and Africa. In this humid forest lived many anthropoids, among them the gorilla, orangutan, he calls it an orang, chimpanzee, and that cousin of theirs from whom mankind is descended. They were all vegetarian, about to the extent that the apes are now, meaning that they lived principally on tubers, nuts, fruits, buds, and tender shoots. Like the present apes, they would catch and eat a few small animals. Living among the branches, or at least able to climb a tree when in danger or in want of a food which grew aloft, these ancestors of man flourished, as long as the woodland remained damp, hot, and substantially unbroken. But, according to the hypothesis, there came a change in old world climate such that areas here and there became too dry to support a forest and turned into prairie. This would not matter at first, while the glades were small. The forest population withdrew from or scampered across the patches of grassland. But if the change in climate was progressive and of continental scope, it would come to pass that islands of forest were surrounded by wide stretches of meadow and treeless plain. As the drying cycle progressed, through centuries and millenniums, the anthropoid tree dwellers would become more and more crowded into their limited asylums. As the forest islands shrank, the prairie grew, and the living space of the grazing animals, horse and cow, antelope and sheep, which starve the woodlands but thrive on grasslands, starve in woodlands but thrive on grasslands, expanded. The anthropoids, as we see them today, and as we know them from remote ages through their teeth and other revealing bone formations, are vegetarians, but not grazing animals. They cannot manage on timothy and bluegrass, but they can live on the flesh of the grass eaters. The first men had to learn to hunt if they wanted to live. They could also scavenge, which they probably did. Theoretically. Like the anthropoids of today, Our remote ancestors doubtless combined rudimentary hunting with gathering. They searched habitually for nests and ate the birdlings as well as the eggs, and the mother bird too, if they could catch her. The anthropoid manner of search for rodents and grubs combines hunting and gathering methods. The theory pictures those of the anthropoids, which found themselves on the grasslands, as facing a new environment. Without the mental equipment of a chimpanzee, equal to that of with about the mental equipment of a chimpanzee equal to that of a 4-year-old child. In the service of a childlike brain, they had the most marvelous tools that nature gave to an animal, a pair of hands. At first, the prairie-stranded anthropoids were chiefly gatherers, finding dead fish along a stream as a partly vegetarian grizzly bear does in Alaska, finding a ground squirrel in its burrow as the chiefly vegetarian grizzlies do in Arctic Canada, finding honey in a bee's nest as the black bears do. The animals that can live on flesh foods, or at least can exist on them for considerable periods, are more numerous than most of us realize. What we think of as strict carnivora, like the eagle, the wolf, and the seal, are but a small segment of the actual and potential flesh eaters. For animals which by choice eat grass will turn to meat when necessity arises. Of these, the best known perhaps are the horses of Iceland, which, in certain districts at certain times, feast on fish. The lean meat of whales, dried and ground into a flour, is a standard cattle feed in parts of Europe. It is well known that rats and similar rodents can live on the bodies of other animals. Most species of fish live mainly or exclusively on other fish. The carnivorous habits of reptiles are notorious. Little snakes swallow mice. A python will swallow a dog. In New England, finding grubs in decaying trees, as the native blackfellows do in Australia, gathering snails as the French do, digging clams as New Englanders do, bird nesting like youngsters all over the world, sucking eggs like a huckleberry Finn or a modern-day chimp. Of these habits, there would be a gradual and natural expansion among those apes who found themselves unable to discover a forest in which to gather what had been their main food, and was still the chief food of their ape cousins in regions of more rain. The prairie ape would have had the ingenuity, as many other animals have, to lie motionless in the grass until some small grazing animal, perhaps a lamb or a kid, came near enough to be seized. Troops of these pre-humans would work together, as troops of baboons still do, for defense and offense. In short, as this theory holds, the apes found it necessary, in the grassland that swarmed with grazing animals, to become ingenious in order to live. While the ancestors of the chimpanzee and gorilla, at home in their accustomed tropical forest, required no more than apish industry and perseverance in the search for roots, shoots, and fruits, what had been good enough for their fathers was good enough for them, served them well enough in a familiar environment, and kept them what they were, anthropoids. On the grasslands, there was now in play a rigorous process of natural selection. Those apes that kept searching for tubers and fruits in a region that no longer contained many of them had less and less chance for survival, as the islands of tree growth along rivers or lakes became increasingly scarce with the progressive change from a heavy forest to a uniform prairie. As the grasses spread to replace the trees, there was more and more food to support more and more antelope, sheep, horses, and buffalo, and thus more and more survival opportunity for those slowly evolving forebears of man whose brains guided their hands toward the use of clubs, the throwing of stones, and finally to the development of knife, spear, and bow. In this transition period, the death rate must have been heavy, not only among those slower of brain and lacking ingenuity, but surely also throughout the prairie communities. There must have been serious trouble in adapting the old vegetarian digestive function to the new food, just as it seems clear that the Iceland pony, which lives on fish, is not quite so well off as his hay-fed brother. There must have been new derangements, producing many an early death, and dietetic lacks, causing deficiency diseases. All these things, if they happened, must have taken place millions of years ago, or at least 1,000,000 years before the current era. During the eons of time since then, the forest-dwelling anthropoids have changed little, so far as can be judged from their preserved bones. In the same space, the near-humans changed to human so effectively that some anthropologists assert that Cro-Magnon man of 20,000 or 30,000 years ago in France was in his physique, if anything, more ideally human than the present-day European, because they look exactly the same. If humanness is measured in terms of difference from the anthropoid. This book, although written by a part-time anthropologist, is not a work of anthropology. Although written by a part-time geographer, it is not a geographic treatise. So I do no more in this introductory chapter than touch upon the facts and theorizing that back up the facts and theorizing that back up the view that man's origin, upon which, as a peg, the 12 chapters that follow are hung. Poorly worded sentence, if you ask me, but anyway. The anthropologists, through their archaeology, and the geologists, through their paleontology, find themselves in agreement that agriculture is a recent development in the evolution of man. For its existence is not provable in any part of the world more than 20,000 years back. Professor Ellsworth Huntington, distinguished authority on man's relation to land and climate, says in his Mainsprings of Civilization, published in 1945, that first agriculture, which he thinks consisted merely in such operations as gathering and storing the kernels of self-sown grains, does not even in that primitive form go back farther than the New Stone Age, much less than 20,000 years, perhaps only 10,000. And this, he thinks, will have been in some such country as Egypt. He considers that those of us who are descended from North Europeans have had agricultural forebears through only 2, 3, or 4,000 years. During the period before agriculture, it is chiefly in the tropics, and not everywhere there, that men could, as some do at the present, live like their anthropoid predecessors and cousins by digging roots and tubers, collecting shoots, bulbs, buds, fruits, and nuts, and by catching a few small creatures. Outside the tropics, pre-farming man was necessarily, in the main, a hunter. Secondarily, he was the gatherer of such animal foods as worms, grubs, and insects, shellfish and fish thrown up along the beach, stranded seals and whales. He scouted around, no doubt, and competed with the hyena and vulture for the bodies of animals that had died of illness, accident, or old age. This necessarily almost complete dependence of pre-agricultural man on animal food is not confined to the grasslands of the world, tropic, temperate, or arctic. It applies nearly as much to some temperate zone and most arctic woodlands, even to many tropic forests. Carl Lumholtz reports, for instance, that when he was with the tropical forest-dwelling natives of northern Australia, they lived mainly on animal food and never ate anything of vegetable nature if flesh foods were available. So from the time when our ancestors ceased being ape-like gatherers of monkey food, down to the substantial growth of agriculture, mankind lived through one or several millions of years, chiefly on the lean and fat of animals. The exception to this would be some groups which drifted back into subtropical and tropic forests of that humid type, which enabled the chimpanzee and gorilla to remain anthropoid. Animal husbandry, true enough, developed before agriculture, or at least there is evidence that it was extensive and widespread through Asia, Africa, and Europe when thoroughgoing agriculture was as yet restricted to special regions, like Egypt and the Fertile Crescent. But dietetically, the herdsman and the hunter are practically at one. There is the difference of the extensive use of milk and its products by the owners of herds, but this difference is superficial, for milk is only a slightly modified form of blood, and blood was always a considerable element in the food of the hunter, insofar as ancient hunters can be judged from those with whom we have come in contact through the history of the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, since records began to be kept on the progress of geographic discovery by European explorers. As I have said, there must have been a lot of digestive and other physical troubles when the anthropoid was changing to man through the rigors of natural selection in a country that had vegetation on which cattle flourished, but apes did not. The few who survived that grueling process to become the first men were, however, of necessity well adapted to the huntsman's diet, content with it, and healthy on it, else they would not have survived. This suitability of organs was naturally inherited by their descendants, or at least by those of them who were healthy, and thus successful on the meat diet of the hunter, or on its slight modification, the meat and milk diet of the herdsman. There is, however, the fundamental drawback to living by means of hunting, that no small area can support a large population. This difficulty is mitigated rather than solved by the domestication of animals, which, for instance, enables a man both to ride a horse for hunting buffalo and also to eat the horse when it is not needed for further use as a mount. The basic difficulty with both hunting and herding is that, by varying estimates, something between 5 and 10 men can live on a given amount of what hogs eat for every one who can live by eating the hogs. So there is a powerful economic pressure for returning to the food habits of our ape-like ancestors, with the modification that, instead of hunting for things to pick up from the ground or to pick off trees, we till the ground for cereals and plant trees that bear fruit. Since we all have an urge to live, and since parents desire that their children shall not go hungry, the development of agriculture followed necessarily as soon as men found out that more of them could live on wheat from plowed soil than could possibly get along by hunting the animals that grazed over the same land. But there are few gains without pains. Just as there must have been ill health and difficult adaptation when the ape man was changing from the diet of the gathering ape to that of the hunting man, so there would be similar trouble when people who had been hunters began to change gradually from a nearly or quite exclusive flesh diet to one that contained more and more of rice, wheat, and corn. The million or so years which had intervened since the ape turned into man had eliminated, by natural selection, those that were best suited for digesting vegetables, since they would have been least suited for digesting meat. Besides, the roots and shoots diet of the ape man in the human forest is markedly different from that of the grain-fed farmer. In this introductory chapter I shall not go deeply into the difficulties encountered by man in making the necessary adjustments when he turned, after ages of hunting and herding, to a diet which, although largely from a vegetable kingdom, was nevertheless strikingly different from that of his pre-human ancestors, a diet not mainly of roots and shoots, nuts and fruits, but of cereals and grains. I rest with quotation and paraphrase of a section from Professor Huntington's Mainsprings of Civilization, in which he discusses the medley of advantages and troubles, some of them definitely known and the rest inferred, that came upon hunting man when he began to try to support large numbers of his kind on small areas through the cultivation of beans, lentils, rice, wheat, oats, and the rest of the cereals. In his chapter, Agriculture, Disease, and Diet, Huntington says, quote, "The ideal diet, it would seem, must be essentially that to which man becomes adjusted during his long, slow evolution. Among most of the ancestors of modern Europeans and Americans, an agricultural diet has prevailed less than 2,000 years. There is no reliable evidence that in the brief span any appreciable change has occurred in the inherited dietary requirements which had become established during the preceding period, perhaps 1,000 times longer." End quote. Huntington, then, believes about 55 million years intervened between the time when early man, or pre-man, ceased depending mainly on the food of apes, and the time when, as an agriculturalist, he returned to a diet which, although similar to that of apes in containing a relatively small percentage of flesh foods, is unlike any previous diet of ape or man in its high percentage of cereals. Huntington thinks, it would appear, that the change in diet brought on through the cultivation of fields introduces a reciprocal relation, for he believes that as it raises the quantity, it lowers the quality of food, the quality being judged by its healthfulness to men who have been living for 2 million years on something else. He says, quote, "The most important effect of agriculture on efficiency probably results from malnutrition. One of the main reasons for poor nutrition is that agriculture has lowered the quality of man's diet and at the same time made it possible for more people to subsist. We're increasing the quantity of people and not the quality, and this is the same thing with the food. Mechanical methods of preparing food have gone still further along this same sad path until the typical modernized diet has become appallingly poor. By modernized, we do not mean the diet now eaten by the more intelligent and prosperous people of Europe and America, but the kind that is still eaten by people at the lower economic levels and in many other countries by the majority of the population. In such a diet, bread, cereals, potatoes, and other forms of starchy food play a dominant part. The rest is largely composed of vegetable protein foods, such as beans, together with carbohydrates in the form of sugar. Huntington summarizes, quote, "Agriculture has been a powerful factor in lowering human efficiency, as well as in advancing civilization. Practically every step of progress is accompanied by drawbacks which are not rectified for a long time. Humanity may have needed most of Huntington's 2,000 years for evolving 2 million. Humanity says 2,000. Humanity must have needed most of Huntington's 2 million years for evolving from the largely vegetarian habit of the anthropoid to where it could make the best use of the diet of the hunter. We should not feel discouraged, then, if in a mere 5 or 10,000 years of agriculture we have not as yet grown fully reconciled, biologically, to the intrusion of large quantities of sugars, starches, vegetable proteins, and vegetable fats, into a regimen which had so long consisted in the main of animal proteins and animal fats. Following the line of Weston Price in his Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, excellent book, Huntington believes that among the effects of the transfer from previous diets to those of the agriculturist are the difficulties that our women have in childbirth, contrasted with the ease of this function among those who live the pre-agricultural type of life. You listening, ladies? Another effect is the tendency to malformed jaws and bad teeth among grain-fed peoples. As to the ease of childbirth under pre-agricultural conditions, it seems to support Price's reasoning, but I shall not here analyze the evidence. Neither do I pursue further the question of whether the common recession of the lower jaw among the Japanese, which gives them a physiognomy made to order for our cartoonists, a little racist there, is due to the large percentage of cereals in their food, nor do I examine in detail the uselessness of wisdom teeth among us caused by a shrinking of the lower jaw to where there is not room left for them, this being allegedly a result of our large dependence on starch and sugar. I do, however, anticipate my chapter, quote, and visit your dentist twice a year, end quote. That's the name of his chapter. I do, however, anticipate in my chapter, visit your dentist twice a year, to the extent of pointing out that Price and Huntington have had many predecessors, as well as followers, with regard to the effect of starches and sugars on the teeth themselves. For instance, Henry B. Collins, Jr., director of the Wartime Ethnogeographic Board, and ethnologist on the staff of the Smithsonian Institution, considers that if archaeologists discover anywhere a group of several skeletons of no matter what probable antiquity, they may be sure that if the teeth have cavities in them, signs of dental caries, then those are the skeletons of a people who had lived under a fairly well-developed agriculture. I hope you're absorbing this. Only people who eat plants have cavities. Practically the whole world is now agricultural in its diet, for even the Eskimos of parts like the north coast of Alaska have succumbed to our food fashions. There are left, however, a few places where men still use the diets that preceded agriculture, and we possess books of the last 3,000 years that tell a good deal of the lives of hunters and herdsmen. It would seem, then, that if the speculative study of our forebears is begun at the stage when they first deserved the name of anthropoid, or ape-human, their dietetic history will fall into three main stages: gathering, hunting, and farming. According to the geologists, the gathering stage, or ape-man period, lasted several million years. During this time, man ate roots and tubers, shoots and succulent leaves, fruits and yams and nuts, worms and snails and rodents, eggs and fledgling birds. This period was long enough for us to become well adapted to digesting and assimilating the diet, to be healthy on it. We can be healthy on it now, as is demonstrated by those vegetarians, like Bernard Shaw, who have money enough to buy these at present rather costly foods. The deficiency group of diseases, malformed bones, difficult childbirth, they seemingly do not trouble these humid forest natives. And those high-income vegetarians who can manage to get enough of the sort of food on which monkeys do well. After the largely vegetarian gathering stage came the hunting stage, during which the ape turned definitely human. This will have lasted between 1 and 3 million years. The period was long enough to enable digestion and assimilation to adapt themselves to a largely carnivorous diet. To judge from present knowledge of so-called savages, the foods of the hunting period ranged from the entirely carnivorous, in lands where grass was plenty and humid forests rare or absent, to a partly carnivorous regimen in places where it was convenient to supplement the flesh diet with a certain amount of monkey food. So far as can now be known, those men who during this stage lived wholly on the new diet, that of the hunter, and those who supplemented the new with the old, were in equally good health. In both cases, the deficiency group of diseases was absent, certainly from the exclusively carnivorous, and probably from those who combined the methods of gathering and hunting. The pastoral way of life does not constitute a separate stage in the history of human diet. For, as we have pointed out, the change was not fundamental. It was only the substitution of milk for blood as an element in the diet, or rather the supplementing of the blood part with a milk part, the milk being a slightly modified form of blood. The third, or agricultural stage of diet, marks a profound change from either of the two previous diets, those of the gathering ape and of the hunting or herding man. For hitherto, as exclusive gatherers in the anthropoid stage and as occasional gatherers in the hunting stage, men could not have had any high percentage of cereal food. A little gathering of wild rice or wild wheat now and then, by small groups here and there, cannot have given the people of 10 or 20,000 years ago much evolutionary preparation for the drastic change that came in when our recent ancestors, in some such place as Egypt, India, or China, discovered that they could support great numbers on small areas by planting crops, which, in practice, were chiefly cereals, at least over great stretches of several continents. 10 or even 20,000 years is a short spell in terms of biologic evolution. So the human mechanism for digesting and assimilating must still be much like what it was when agriculture thrust upon the human race a change in diet that was nearly as profound as the one which had been forced on the anthropoid long ago when he faced the choice of hunting or perishing. I have suggested that there must have been a cycle of malnutrition, discomfort, and early deaths that lasted many thousands of years, while the mechanism of the body for handling monkey food was being adapted to handling considerable and at length very high percentages of flesh foods. It is doubtful that mankind is as yet through biologically with the worst of the corresponding period of change from the hunting and pastoral to the agricultural way of life. Much has been printed on the general state of the public health in the Americas and Europe, and it, at any rate, can be judged absolutely. Relatively, we are not so clear on facts and views, those of us who read the newspapers and supplement them with books on medicine, dietetics, physiology. It is practically the anthropologists alone, the students of prehistory and of modern primitives, who seem aware that broad conditions of health, as influenced by food, were ever fundamentally different from what they now are. For most branches of the sciences which deal with health never have been jolted from a nearly unquestioning acceptance of the predominantly agricultural civilization into which we were born, and in which we and our neighbors and nearly all the people we have ever heard of have lived. On their agricultural diets now taken for granted, this nation, like most or all other civilized nations, is having a deal of trouble with malnutrition. Except among those who can afford a lot of hunting man's food, like beefsteaks and chicken, or a lot of monkey food, like fresh fruit and raw vegetables, except for these fortunates, we suffer on our usual diets with endemic deficiency problems. Among them, pellagra, beriberi, scurvy, rickets, contracted lower jaws, and poor teeth. Even the prosperous among us do not quite escape, for not all their forethought and care will prevent such records as a 95% incidence of tooth decay in the high school senior class of a fashionable suburb, and a 98% decay ratio for the senior class of any college. Things like dental caries and rickets are the commonplaces of the only way of life known to most of us, whether by trial or by vivid hearsay. Such troubles have been with us since agriculture began, thus from prehistoric times. Most of us conceive of nothing different, take it as inevitable, as the common lot of man, the pains and derangements which we suppose to have been universal at all times and in all places. If we discuss general health problems, it is usually with regard to details. Perhaps whether the caries incidence among high school seniors is 95% or only 90%, and whether some way could not be found to reduce it by 5 or 10% more. No one thinks of the decay ratio being reduced to anything like 0%. And certainly no one would, 50, it's supposed to say 50. It says so percent. Just so you know I'm not lying about, it's not focusing. Just so you know I'm not lying about typos. That's one example. So I had to guess that it was saying 0, but then the next one is 0. Okay, so it's probably supposed to say 20 or 50. No one thinks of the decay ratio being reduced to anything like 50%, and certainly no one would talk of reducing it to 0, at least unless some revolutionary discovery were to be made. However, we are accustomed to comparing the results of changes in diet and to discussing the health consequences of various dietary systems. Much has been published, for instance, about questions of health that involve comparisons between agricultural diets and those vegetarian regimens which are of the monkey food type. Green vegetables, yellow vegetables, nuts, fruits, sprouts, shoots, roots, and the juices of fruits and vegetables. Bernard Shaw has been along this line in education in himself. Thus we are posted on comparing the foods of our pre-human ancestors with those of a farming man. In contrast, relatively little that has been printed is available for a comparison of the diets of agricultural man with those of the hunters whose lives spanned the millions or it says so again. 20 years? Oh, the million or so years. This time it's supposed to say so. Excuse me. In contrast, relatively little that has been printed is available for the comparison of the diets of agricultural man with those of the hunters, whose lives spanned the million or so years between ape and farmer. This comparative lack started me 20 years ago, gathering material for what I hoped would be a substantial contribution to a relatively neglected branch of knowledge. The results of the study were to be described in a series of books which would carry the overall title, The Lives of Hunters. But of that work, this volume, Not by Bread Alone, is the first installment. In it, as in the rest of the study, I draw upon my training as an anthropologist, my experience of living exclusively on meat among exclusive meat eaters, and a lifetime of studying books and other records that deal with hunting and pastoral man. I draw, too, upon manuscript and verbal contributions from numerous personal friends and scientific colleagues among explorers, geographers, anthropologists, and physiologists. In this introductory volume, but naturally more so in the work as a whole, I am trying to furnish material for a sounder comparison than has hitherto been practicable between our lives as an agricultural people and the lives of others whom I have known directly or vicariously, and who still live by hunting, much as our forefathers presumably did through the rather considerable stretch of time, whether it be 2 million or only 200,000 years, from the period when their ancestors and ours became human to the time when the ancestors of some of us became farmers. Next chapter will be the home life of Stone Age man. And then the third chapter, the field experience, I believe. Nope, the fourth one. The fourth one is when he gets into, it's called the laboratory check. And it's about living for a year under strict observation, eating only meat, to prove scientifically, incontrovertibly, that you can live on nothing but meat and fat. The author and a guy named Anderson, they did that together. They stayed at a hospital, eating nothing but meat, all day, every day. All right, catch you on the next chapter. Hope you enjoyed that one. I hope when I make a mistake it doesn't ruin your enjoyment too much. But I think in spite of my mistakes, in spite of the typos, I'm still doing a better job than the other audiobook that's available on YouTube. At least that's my hope. Please let me know. Because that's kind of the point of me doing this, is to have a better audiobook available. That's my contribution to society for now. All right, thanks for listening. Hope you're enjoying it. You're gonna really like it when he starts talking about living with the Eskimos. I'm gonna try to record it as fast as possible, but I do have a life, so it might be a month or two before I get through all of it. But if you're encountering this after I've recorded the whole book, then that's not an issue for you. If you're encountering it, sometime in November, December, maybe January 2023, or November, December 2022, then you might be like, hurry up. I want to hear all the chapters. All right. Talk to you later. Stay healthy. Don't eat grains or vegetable oils. Talking to you. Yeah, you.